Welcome back, Econ friends. In our first video, we gave a really brief overview of the ADAS model. We talked about what it can do, how it's used. I briefly gave you the names of the three pieces. In this video, let's dig a bit deeper into those three components. Let's flesh out what they are, what they look like, their shifts, and some other details. Once we're done with that, in later videos, we'll put all those curves together and understand equilibrium, and then we'll do some applications, okay? So let's jump in, and let's start off with aggregate demand, AD. So the first thing to understand is that the AD curve is a downward sloping curve. So AD is downward sloping, and this curve shows the relationship, because we're always talking about how two things are related. In the case of the AD curve, it's a downward sloping curve that shows the relationship between the price level on one hand and the quantity of domestically produced goods and services on the other hand. By definition, the AD curve shows the relationship between the price level and, to be very precise, the quantity of domestically produced goods and services that all households, business firms, governments, and foreigners are willing to purchase. In other words, it shows the connection between the price level and real GDP. And let's remember, as always, that our real GDP formula, which we abbreviate as Y, and which we now know is the same as AD, was C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C being consumption, household purchases, I being investment, business purchases, G standing for government purchases, and at the end here, our X minus M being net exports. You take those four components, and that explains how we put together households, firms, governments, and foreigners in our definition. So the AD curve simply shows the amount of real GDP that will generate at any given price level. You can see it right here. Simple curve. Note briefly that on this axis, we're going to put price level. That's the overall price level. It's not the price of one good. It's the average or overall price level. In other words, it's the rate of inflation. And down here is our output, which we're going to call, as we know, real GDP. You take a look at this and you can see that the AD curve, downward sloping, okay? Why is it downward sloping? Well, I'm glad you asked. In economics, we believe that the AD curve slopes downward for three specific reasons. The first reason is what we call the wealth effect. The wealth effect basically says that a lower price level will increase the purchasing power of money. We know that money draws its value from its purchasing power. That's its store of value. It's the meaning of exchange part of it, okay? If the average price level is lower, your money can buy you more. So the wealth effect says that a lower price level will increase the purchasing power of your money. Specifically, the relationship would be this, okay? Ceteris paribus, all else equal. If the price level increases, purchasing power falls and consumption, C, falls. And since consumption is a part of GDP, AD falls. On the other hand, if price levels decrease, your money now has more purchasing power and consumption will rise. So our first reason, the wealth effect. Our second reason for the downward sloping AD curve is what we call the interest rate effect. The interest rate effect says that a lower price level will reduce the demand for money A lower price level will reduce the demand for money and therefore lower the real interest rate. A lower price level will reduce the demand for money. That will lower the real interest rate. And as you know, lower interest rates will stimulate additional purchases. The relationship works out like this. Ceteris paribus, if the price level rises, interest rates will rise and consumption and investment will fall. On the other hand, if the price level falls, rates will fall, and as a result, consumption and investment, C and I, will increase. So that's our second big reason, the interest rate effect. And the third explanation for the downward sloping AD is what we're going to call the net export effect. And this ties in to our X minus M part of our equation. The net export effect says that a lower price level will make domestically produced goods. Okay, let's go through this again. A lower price level will make goods that are produced in this country less expensive relative to foreign goods. So if the overall price level here in America falls, then domestically produced American products will be relatively less expensive compared to foreign products. And therefore, the relationship says that, again, ceteris paribus, any decrease in the price level will increase net exports, and any increase in the price level will reduce them. And as you know from our formula, that will trickle through into real GDP, okay? So we know that the AD curve is downward sloping. We know there's three reasons. Now let's talk through shifts. Because much like our regular supply and demand curves, we also have the ability to shift AD. Now, there's a lot of different factors, many things that can shift aggregate demand. But right now, let's lay out some of the major ones so that you can get your analysis going and start making sense of real world events and their impact on those macroeconomic short-run fluctuations, okay? So what factors can shift AD? Well, the first one would be changes in the expectations that businesses and households have about the future direction of the economy. So changes in expectations, both from the household view and the business view. Changes in expectations about where the economy is headed, about the future direction, that's going to impact today's consumption. In fact, there's a whole index that the University of Michigan puts together that is called the Consumer Sentiment Index. And what this does is it polls people randomly, it asks a series of questions about attitudes, and over time, they plot out the ups and downs of consumer sentiment, of consumer feeling, of consumer comfort or fear about the economy, okay? So we can shift AD if expectations change. We also know from our earlier lectures that we can change AD through monetary and fiscal policies. You'll recall that monetary policies work by influencing the interest rate. Fiscal policies either directly affect G or indirectly affect C and I through tax changes. So those two policies that we've covered our last couple lectures, monetary and fiscal, we called them monetary policy and fiscal policy. We call them stabilization policies. We've called them government intervention policies. But at their core, from the ADAS framework, they're designed to shift the AD curve. Another thing that can shift the AD curve are changes in real wealth. Note that for Americans, well, actually take a step back. Note when we say wealth, we're not talking about income. Wealth and income are separate. Income refers to how much you make in salary or other money in a given year, but wealth refers to the overall size of what you're worth. Okay, you can think of it that as your income grows, that will contribute to your wealth. So they're related, but they are in a subtle way distinct. So don't get them confused. What's important to note is that for many people, especially for Americans, much of our wealth is composed of either stock or mutual fund ownership, as well as housing ownership. This implies that, for example, when the housing market is booming and growing and house prices are rising, homeowners will see their home prices rise, they'll feel wealthier, and they'll spend more. In a related way, people who have money in stocks and mutual funds, when the stock market is booming and the market is going up, that means that your values of your shares are going up, your portfolio size is going up, you're going to feel wealthier and you're going to spend more. And we see that predictably whenever there's ups and downs in real estate or ups and downs in the stock market. It affects people's wealth, which in turn affects their consumption. Another factor that can shift a demand curve, generally to the left, would be the onset of either financial distress or just general uncertainty. When people get scared, when people feel insecure about the markets, about the economy, they tend to pull back. They tend to kind of slow and dampen consumption and spending. They save a bit more money. They prep for the rainy day. Okay. We can also see a shift from changes in the expected rate of inflation. And finally, we can see AD change if there are changes in global economic conditions. This includes changes in foreign income, as well as changes in exchange rates. Okay, so any of these things, if they happen, will shift AD. You see right here in this graph, or these two graphs, in panel A, we'll see a decrease in AD. This is going to be a shift to the left. You can see right here the different causes, but the key thing to understand, we started off here, I'll put it in blue, with AD, and then something happened and we got a shift to the left because AD decreased, and this takes us to the left to a new curve. Over here in panel B, we see the same thing, just the opposite way. We see an increase in AD. We start right here, again in blue, with our original AD curve. Something happens, we identify what it is, and if it's an increase in AD, it shifts us to the right to a brand new AD curve, which we would call AD, well, he calls it AD2, I would call it AD1, but you get the idea. In the original curve and a new curve. So my friends, you understand what AD, aggregate demand, is. You know that it slopes downward. You know why it slopes downward, and you know that it can shift, and you now know why and how it can shift. Thanks for tuning in. In our next video, we'll jump over to AS. See you in a bit.